these violent mobs can be oddly comforting, because it reminds us that people are people, and they've been people for centuries, and they're frail human beings sometimes who feel jealous or angry or proud or happy and elated. And I think that's really exciting to see that take shape in a different time and a different place, and how then it affected that time and place.
Everybody ready to get their history on? My name is Edgar B. Herwick III. I'm with WGBH. I run a little outfit we call the Curiosity Desk. I do stories on radio and TV, but more importantly, tonight I am your host for BostonTalks, and we're going to be looking at some... And it is a party, ladies and gentlemen. Excellent. We're going to look at some offbeat history here in the hub.
So I'm going to be speaking to you tonight about the sweet side of Boston. So it all started in 1765 when the first chocolate mill was established in Boston, actually in Dorchester. And Boston, in my opinion, was really ripe to become the center of candy making, or one of the major centers of candy making in the country, because there were sugar refineries here, there was a big population, and they liked their sugar. Fast forward about 70 years to mid-19th century. In 1847, Oliver Chase invented the first candy-making machine, and this was pretty significant because it was the Industrial Revolution. It was around the same time other things like the grain elevator were being invented, and the way it happened was that Oliver and his brother Silas were pharmacists. And do you remember in Mary Poppins, they sing the song, "Spoonful of sugar helps the medicine go down"? So they actually took that to heart. One of the ways that they delivered bitter medicine for their customers was by combining it into a sugar lozenge. So he created a candy machine that automated this process, and they established Chase and Brothers and started making these wafers. Now, they were originally apparently called hub wafers, but they became known as Necco Wafers. These guys are about 175 years old. That's wild. And they really haven't changed much since then. The same 8 flavors. No one knows what the purple one is. Does anyone know what the purple one is? Raise your hand. I do. It's clove. Everyone hates the black ones except for certain people like me who are weird and like licorice. So there were a whole bunch of candy makers in this area, and they were not only inventing new candies, but they were really inventing new machinery to make the candies. And that was really exciting. They invented machines to pulverize sugar or create taffy. And so a lot of the candy names that you might be familiar with, like Charleston Chew and Sugar Babies and Mary Jane's, and Conversation Hearts, which Silas and Oliver Chase, their brother Daniel, got in on the candy company action and the family business, and he invented Conversation Candy, which eventually became Sweethearts. Now, they say that in the 6 weeks leading up to Valentine's Day, which we just passed Valentine's Day, they make 6 to 8 million of these. That's wild. So they're still pretty popular. In 1901, they combined forces with another local candy company. They started the New England Confectionery Company, or Necco. They built a facility in Boston. Then they built a facility in Cambridge, and they were the first candy company in Cambridge on what became Confectioners Row, which is Main Street. So other candy companies started building their facilities, their manufacturing facilities right there. And at a certain point, they were up to about 150, 140 candy companies right there on Confectioners Row. But then what happened was things started to take a downturn, and 3 major candy companies in the country started buying up all of the candy companies in the US, and they were Mars, Nestle, and Hershey's. Unfortunately, Necco could not compete with them, but they found their niche. They started acquiring mostly local candy companies that made products like squirrel nut zippers and Clark bars and these little guys, Mary Jane's, you either love them or hate them, peanut butter and molasses. There's a history of molasses here in Boston, as we know. They also continued to create their own original stuff. Sky bars. I had never heard of these until I moved here, and these are just like 4 candy bars in one. Yes. So they were innovating candy and staying alive by finding this retro candy niche. The really interesting thing about going back to Necco Wafers is, first of all, these are almost indestructible. So I think that's why they've been around so long. In fact, there's a story about a Necco employee at the Cambridge facility in 1993 who opened a drawer, found, oh no, I think it was Canada Mints actually, which are pretty similar. And they were from 1952. And he was like, why not? So he tried them, and he said they were actually pretty good. They had lasted that long. Now, they say the shelf life is 3 to 5 years, so I don't recommend that you eat, 50-year-old candy, but if there's a zombie apocalypse, just know that they'll probably be okay for a good time. So Necco Wafers have been eaten by Union soldiers in the Civil War. They've been eaten by our troops in both World Wars. They've been on polar explorations to both the North and South Pole. Pretty amazing history. So that's the local candy history. It's really down to Necco now. I'm going to move on to another sweet topic. So besides pie, the second most popular sweet in the mid-19th century was, anyone care to guess? They're pretty popular now. Donuts. So donuts were actually invented in Maine by a ship captain's mom. Supposedly, she put nuts in the middle of the donut, and that's why it's called a donut. She did that so it would cook more evenly. The ship captain, Hanson Gregory, took it a step further and put the hole in the donut. So that is the first donut as we know it, invented in New England. They have a history with whaling ships. Whaling ship captains, and as you may or may not know, New Bedford was the capital of the whaling industry in the mid-19th century in the US, and that was a big deal. Whaling ship captains would reward the crew for making 1,000 barrels of whale oil by giving them a whole big batch of donuts. And guess what they fried them in? Whale oil. So this story goes, they loved them. It was pretty exciting. It was a real treat when you're out on the seas for weeks. And apparently if you heat the whale oil high enough, it doesn't get absorbed into the donut, so you don't necessarily have a whale oil tasting donut. I'm kind of waiting for one of the local donut companies to start making whale oil donuts. If anyone sees that, please tweet me. I at least want to try it once. Finally, I want to talk about another product that kind of came from Maine, and those are Neeham Bars. Has anyone ever had one? It's potato candy. It's basically coconut, sugar, and potato as a binding element, and it's enrobed in chocolate. Now, before you turn your nose up at that, they're really quite delicious. It doesn't taste very much of potato. It's very faint. I made some in my own kitchen for you guys, so if you'd like to try them, here they are. And the story goes that they might have been named for a reverend of the name of Needham. Another story, who they say may or may not have been from Needham, Massachusetts. Another story is that there was a potato glut in Maine, and they figured out this was a way to get rid of extra potatoes. Still a mystery, so that's something that I plan to investigate in my research. Thanks a lot, guys.
Let's hear it for Amanda Balagur! You got a lot of candy.
Oh, yeah.
Wow. I wonder,
Candy.
we're sort of in this, we're in this period now where, there's like the sugar crisis kind of thing about candy and stuff like that.
About not eating sugar.
Say again?
You mean there's an emphasis on not eating too much sugar?
Yeah, there's an emphasis on not eating too much sugar. There's an emphasis on, we have, a crisis in America over obesity, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
I think about, when I've read about things like the history of something like Coca-Cola, for example, where they're like, it had medicinal qualities in the beginning and stuff like that. Was there a sense about candy in those early years? Do you have a sense of how it was viewed at the time?
Well, originally sugar was a luxury item. And in medieval times, it did make its way to Europe because it grows in tropical conditions. So it was really rare and really precious, and it did supposedly have medicinal qualities.
Really? Yeah.
But it only became readily available to almost everyone around the time that I was talking about by the 19th century. It was cheap enough for everyone to eat it, and that may be where the problem, that might have been the tipping point. So, I have nothing against sugar, obviously.
Do you personally have a favorite candy of all of these kind of, not your favorite
that's
candy of
really
all time,
tough.
but like among like all of these kind of New England candies?
Yeah, the malted milk ball.
Wow, there's
So
a lot of
good.
agreement from here.
Yeah.
So what makes the malted milk ball so good?
I don't know. It's that extra. It's almost like umami that you get from malt. It's that extra unique flavor. It kind of reminds you. It's like eating a sundae.
It's pretty good. Amanda Balagur, everybody.
It's perfect that music and candy is a segue here, because I think anyone that went to the Middle East around the 80s especially will remember when the Necco factory was in full swing. You'd be standing there on Central Square, and you'd feel like you were in the middle of a Necco wafer because the smell was just so strong coming from the factory. All right, so our rock and roll history, it goes back quite a ways, way back long before the things you know. And one of my theories is that in Boston, kind of our two traditions, like our Puritan tradition and our Bohemian tradition, have always been pushing and pulling at each other for decades and decades. I'm going to refer to this here book here. And so if you go back to where it all started in terms of there being a rock and roll scene, you trace it back to John Eliot Square in Roxbury. Now, at least three very notable things happened on John Eliot Square. In 1632, the Puritans established the first church on this site. In 1775, William Dawes, who was a good buddy and compatriot of Paul Revere, began his ride from the same spot. And then a mere 180 years later, in 1955, this happened. Yes, Zing Zang Zoo means I love you true. This is the G-Clefs. The G-Clefs were the first group that ever had a hit out of Boston. They had a song called Ka-Ding Dong. They were very into alliteration and very into lyrical profundity. But in a lot of ways, the G-Clefs were almost the antithesis of what a rock and roll group should have been in 1955. They weren't juvenile delinquents. They were five guys that were very dapper and very well dressed. And they were, in some ways, the roots were the opposite of what Elvis was all about, because Elvis was a white guy who used to go to Baptist churches and copped a lot of his style from places like that. Whereas the G-Clefs were five black guys who went to an integrated Catholic church in Roxbury, and that's where they learned to sing. And so if you listen to, they have more records that are a little more ballady than what you just heard, and the sort of very, very proper, very New England-y kind of sound. And finally, reputing the whole live fast, die young idea of rock and roll. Four of the five guys who made that record are still with us. They still perform from time to time. One of the G-Clefs, a guy named DeLonga, is behind the Urban Nutcracker that I believe still has been a popular attraction in Boston over the years. So they have endured. As we get into the 60s, a lot of things happened in Boston, and we weren't exactly sure what kind of sound was going to be coming out of this city. Was there going to be garage music? Yeah, there was some of that. We had a band called Barry and the Remains, who opened for most famously opened for the Beatles at their very last tour. They played the very last Beatles concert at San Francisco, and the Remains, in fact, still exist. They're going to be performing in Cambridge in about 2 months, and we had quite a few other things going on. But one thing that we didn't have in Boston was a lot of surf, because that happened in California. However, one thing people don't know is that surf music was pretty much invented by a Bostonian. A guy named Dick Dale was from Quincy. He grew up around here and was part of a Greek immigrant family. So when he got to California, he cranked up the reverb and did that kind of sound you heard in Greek folk music, the balakas, that a lot of fast picking. Put a lot of reverb into that, you get surf music, and that's what Dick Dale started doing in California. However, you are not going to necessarily get a lot of surf music happening in Boston for obvious reasons. That didn't stop a band called the Dolphins, who made a record that nobody ever heard in 1965, I believe. You are going. If we play some of this record now, it's probably going to quadruple the number of people who have ever heard it. And this, however, does need to be heard because Boston bands always had a masterful approach to lyric writing, and I think what you hear in this song is one of the great couplets of all time. From Narragansett to Old Cape Cod, if you don't dig surfing, you're a clod. So let's hear some of Surfing East Coast, if we may. Got it? Gonna let it run until we hear that immortal line. And you can ride the best in Key West, surfing East Coast, from Myrtle Beach to Hampton Maine, to Jekyll Island, if I could get there, surfing East Coast. So that was a taste of the massively unsuccessful surf music movement in Boston. One thing that did catch on to a much bigger extent was the blues. We can owe a lot of that to the fact that a club that's now known as Club Passim, at that time it was Club 47. You've all been there, I hope. Lovely little hole in the wall on Harvard Square. During 1965-66, a lot of blues legends were beginning a comeback tour. They had been shuttled off to popular culture for a while. And then people like Muddy Waters, people like Howlin' Wolf started performing in this tiny little hole in the ground. And a lot of white kids that had heard about this kind of music got the opportunity to hear it in the flesh, and their minds were duly blown. They would go home and start to play it themselves, and you get really not noticed but very influential things like this. If we could hear a bit of Messing with the Kid, please. See if you, I think you may recognize the voice on this record, but it's not one that was ever released. Can't really mistake that voice. This is the Hallucinations. Their lead singer was Peter Wolf, and within about a year's time, this group would mutate into the Jay Giles Band. Now, another thing that influenced Boston to quite a big extent was the underground scene, which started really exploding around 66, 67. Legendary clubs like the Tea Party, the Psychedelic Supermarket. One group that blew a lot of minds at that time came up from New York. They were called the Velvet Underground. Even though they are associated forever with New York, they did have a lot of Boston connections. Doug Yule, who replaced John Cale in the original lineup, was a Bostonian, and they did live here and play here for quite a while. So if we could hear a bit of Come Down Now, we'll hear how they influenced a very important band. is a cover of a Velvet Underground song done by a band called Captain Swing, actually. They were not that well known, but they changed a couple members and became the Cars. And the influence of the Velvet Underground and underground music of that ilk would endure in the Cars music for quite some time. So how am I doing time-wise? About to wrap it up. Okay, I'll play you a slight taste of one more thing. Since we're talking about offbeat Boston, we can't let that go by without a mention of a guy named G.G. Allen. Unfortunately, a mention is about all I can give you. If anybody is familiar with this gentleman's work, you might want to Google it. He was known for going on stage and doing unmentionable things. The only show I ever saw of his was at Green Street Station in Jamaica Plain. The show ended about 20 seconds after it began, and there was a lot of cleaning up that had to be done later on. That is the id of Boston as it expressed itself and put the Puritan tradition to rest. There's a lot more of this to be discovered, but I'll leave you with that. Thank you.
Brett Milano. Wow, you know a whole bunch, man.
I try.
So, we heard a lot of examples of stuff that you're probably not going to hear anywhere else, these kind of quirky little things. Is there a band or a record that you might suggest, like beyond just kind of like the, oh, isn't this neat? That maybe is like a Boston band that's a little bit less known, but is it a record worth really going out, either buying or exploring or searching or spending some time with? Yeah,
I'd say if you're going to get one like sort of underground Boston record, get the Live at the Rat compilation from 1976, because that was a weekend where a whole lot of great Boston bands, the Real Kids, Willie Alexander, DMZ, who kind of became the Liars, the music that would be some of the greatest stuff you ever heard for decades on end. And there was a weekend of recording sessions at that legendary club, and it became a double album and has become a CD and should be in every collection.
Nice. How many of you folks here had been to the Rat? And how many folks here who have not been there have heard somebody tell a story about the Rat, right? Like, yeah, that's me. I was never there. What made it so great? Like, when I talk to everybody from, like, my barber to, my friends who play music, everybody's got a story about the Rat. It was legendary. It was amazing. What was so great about it?
Nobody can remember. That's what was so great about it.
Yeah. It's a screen you can project anything on.
No, I think for me, the answer is the music was consistently so good, and so many people you liked would be there on any given night. And if you wanted to indulge to excess, go ahead. But a lot of people just were sitting by the bandstand taking notes all through it.
All right, Brett Milano, everybody.
So I'm going to talk to you guys about violence in Boston. And I don't know if you guys, while watching the news or reading the newspaper, feel disheartened or unsettled sometimes by what seems like a never-ending stream of violence going on in the world today. But I can assure you that Boston was equally, if not more dangerous in the 1760s and 70s, which is what I'm going to talk to you about today, that period leading up to the American Revolution. We're going to talk about two events that were completely outrageous in their violence. One was against property and one was against person. Now, in 1765, the Stamp Act had just been passed. Boston was a small town, and they resented the stamp tax not having any say in it. It was passed by Parliament. Boston at this time was a town of about 15,000 people in 1765. So if you didn't know someone in town, someone in your large family would probably know that person. So Boston was a small town, and it was unhappy with the Stamp Act. And a mob, approved by the rebel leaders, went to the home and office of the man named to be the Stamp Act collector, Andrew Oliver. They destroyed both his home and office, and he resigned the next day. And that's the good kind of 18th century violence. That's intimidation. That's not any sort of really over-the-top violence. But a separate mob took it a different way 2 weeks later. Now, what makes this second mob so dangerous is that they weren't sanctioned by rebel leaders. They were operating outside of 18th century violent norms. And there were violent norms in the 18th century. Thomas Hutchinson was their target. Now, Thomas Hutchinson was reviled in Boston because he was rich and privileged. There were plenty of rich and privileged people in Boston. But so why was Hutchinson a target? Well, primarily because he was so hated because he held multiple political offices. So while being lieutenant governor, the second highest ranking man in political office in Massachusetts Bay Colony, he was also the chief justice. So this is a massive conflict of interest that colonists caught on to and were dismayed by. So they'd hated Hutchinson for years, but on this day in August 1765, they show Hutchinson how much they hate him. You guys, the mob goes to his home, and I should mention, while they're on his way, Hutchinson gets word that they're coming, and he tells his children to flee, and his very brave daughter says she will not leave without her dad. And fortunately for her, her dad loved her more than he loved himself, and he took off to save her. They took off just in the nick of time to see the mob coming. The mob ransacked Hutchinson's home. They broke every window. They smashed every piece of furniture. They stole his paintings. They stole his money. You guys will love this. They drank all the alcohol in his cellar. And as you can imagine, the more they drank from the cellar, the more they thought it'd be a good idea to also knock down all the trees in his garden and level his fences. So they weren't just destroying his 3-story mansion, they were also destroying the garden. Hutchinson was shocked by this and estimated that over 10,000 people walked by to gawk at what was left of his home. Now, the crazy thing about this is that this would be something that was perpetrated by his own neighbors. Hutchinson actually had a home, his home was not far from Paul Revere's home. So this would be done by neighbors. Now, they didn't know exactly who did it. They had kind of a suspicion. That man was arrested as the ringleader of this violence. And another mob formed and said, if you don't release this man, then we're going to riot again. And he was promptly released. So think about this. There's no police force at this time, and it's just mob correcting mob correcting mob. So that is a bit unsettling to me. The second story is even more shocking. So Hutchinson had the good sense to leave his home before the mob arrives. But what happens if you don't have the good sense to leave before the mob arrives? That happened to John Malcolm in 1774. Now, a lot happened in Boston between 65 and 74. Troops arrived, 2,000 British troops arrived and took over Boston. The Boston Massacre happened, 5 people killed. And the Boston Tea Party happened in late December 1773. And our story picks up in 1774, January. So just 6 weeks after Boston Tea Party. Here's what happens. It's January in Boston, not this January, but picture any other January. Picture last January. There was a foot or two of snow on the ground. And in the North End, kids were sledding down from the top of Copp's Hill, which was the highest point in North End. They were loving the snow. Guess who wasn't loving the snow? John Malcolm. Because a kid sleds into the back of his leg, and Malcolm gets into a fight with this young child. That's not a fight you're going to win, right? So George Hughes, a man who'd participated in the Tea Party just 6 weeks earlier, walks by and sees Malcolm shouting at this young kid and says, "Leave the guy alone." Well, that's enough for John Malcolm. He turns and takes his cane and strikes Hughes over the head, leaving Hughes with a humongous 2-inch gash on his head. Now, Hughes was a popular guy, and Malcolm was a very unpopular guy. So word quickly spread, and a mob surrounds Malcolm's house that night. Malcolm takes his family and hides on the second floor. The mob is undeterred by this second floor. They take ladders and plunk them up against the side of his home in the North End, climb the ladders, break the windows, grab Malcolm. Luckily, they leave his family alone. At least they don't physically harm them, to say nothing of the psychological harm they felt when the head of their household was dragged out this window and brought down to the ground, where he was stripped naked, tied up, and tarred and feathered. Now, when we think of tarring and feathering, we often think of hot tar, like the tar out on the streets today. And it wasn't exactly hot tar at this time. Think of more pine tar. So it would get warm, but very sticky, and those feathers would be placed on. It wasn't meant to cause bodily harm, although it sometimes did. In Malcolm's case, it did. But it was meant to embarrass, and it embarrassed Malcolm. So then Malcolm, tarred and feathered, gets thrown into a cart, and he becomes the grand marshal of a terrible parade. He gets paraded. He's the only member, the only float. He gets paraded through Boston. They take him all the way out to Boston Neck, which was the edge of town. That's where the hangings happened. They put a noose around his neck. Malcolm didn't know if he would be hanged that night. While he's got the noose around his neck, no, they decide to whip him and beat him, mostly with sticks. Remember, this is January. It's freezing cold, and he's covered in only tars and feathers. So after this beating and whipping, they then drag him around for a few more hours where he becomes unconscious. They cart him back and dump him in front of his home. He survives. This is gruesome, but he goes to London shortly thereafter, and he brought, as proof of his brutal treatment in Boston, chunks of his skin that had flaked off. So, Hutchinson's home, destroyed by his neighbors. John Malcolm, tarred and feathered, and guys, this was the worst example of tarring and feathering, the most violent in all of colonial American history. It would not be topped. John Malcolm wins that award. So, in case you're reading the news or listening to the news on WGBH, or watching on TV, and you start to feel dismayed, you can think of Hutchinson and Malcolm and not be glad at their displeasure, but just know people were equally strange and violent in 250 years ago. Thank you, guys.
Brooke Barbier. Let's hear it for her. So I'm fascinated by this whole mob thing.
Yeah.
Do you have a sense of how long the mob ruled? Not any of these particular mobs, but I mean, the way you say it, I'm sitting here thinking, all right, if I'm alive in this time period, I probably participated in, 15, 16 mobs a year. It sort of depends on my political views, which side I'm on. But like, when do you have a sense of when we stopped moving from the mob doing all this policing to something a little bit more organized? Or
Well, I mean, we didn't have a formal police force into the early 19th century, so it really was up to one another. We had a sheriff, but he had no power at all. He'd come by and say, "Guys, stop it," and they'd throw rocks at him.
We're a mob.
Yeah, they'd throw
We'll
rocks.
tar and
Literally.
feather you.
Yeah, throw rocks at him, and he'd, okay, fine. So, so it continues. It doesn't just end with the revolution.
So this might sound like a weird question, but I don't mean this like sort of jokingly, but
Yeah.
as somebody who's sort of studied this stuff and looked at this and been like, all right, here are examples of like mob violence. Do you read that and see pros and cons of the mob violence? Or is it just all in retrospect, this was just really bad?
No, sure, they got the job done. Andrew Oliver resigned from his post as Stamp Act collector, and that was the goal. And Boston was the first to violently rebel against the Stamp Act, and then Rhode Island, they were pretty lunatics too. They said, yeah, that sounds great, and they got in on it, and other colonies also followed. So there's a pro in that it got the job done, and that was the sort of sanctioned violence that was allowed. But what the negative is when you're destroying person or property, really for no good reason. Malcolm was hated, but there were much worse men out there who didn't suffer the same treatment. He was just in the wrong place at the wrong time.
Real quick, explain to us what what your tours are about. What happens?
Oh, thanks. So we go along the Freedom Trail, and we see historic sites, and we talk about Boston from 1765 to 1775, and how we go from a colonial society that's pretty complacent and happy to be British to a town that really is leading the charge against breaking away from England and the war beginning in 1775. Most importantly, though, we stop at 3 taverns and have a beer in each along the way.
And then enact mob justice.
Yeah, I know. So a friend tonight asked...
all over the neighborhood.
Yeah, exactly. A friend tonight asked if I brought props, and I said, no, we're just going to break out in a mob, this side versus this side after we're done. So yeah, the tour is a good time.
All right, Brooke Barbier, everybody.
I'm going to mix you a cocktail, not a real cocktail, but a mythical cocktail, a virtual cocktail. It will be 1 part fact, 2 parts myth, 3 parts speculation, with just a twist of conjecture at the rim. And of course, I'm speaking of Boston's own cocktail, something called the Ward 8. And Ward 8 is an enigma wrapped in a mystery and served chilled in a cocktail glass. We're going to talk about that, but first, I teach journalism, I'm a professor, so I always like to start by asking the class a question. So here's my question to you. When a publisher comes to you and says, we will pay you to do a book on Boston's drinking history, what is the correct answer? Yeah, yes. Although I will accept hell yes as an alternative. So that's what happened to me. I had this opportunity to write this book, and so I immediately thought I would spend a lot of time in bars, and I did, but I also spent a lot of time in libraries and in archives and in talking to mixologists, which is a fancy way of talking about bartenders. But we have this amazing craft cocktail movement going on right now, and so we like to call people mixologists. So I sat down with one of the best-known mixologists in Boston, a guy named Jackson Kenyon, and I said, Jackson, what is a cocktail that's associated with Boston? I mean, New York has the Manhattan, New Orleans has the Sazerac, the Hurricane. At the Kentucky Derby, we all drink mint juleps. But what does Boston have? And forget about Cape Codders. I don't like those. What does Boston have? And he had an answer. And he told me the story of the Ward 8. And this is the story he told me. In 1898, at Lochovers, people remember Lochovers? A group of Irish political activists, there's something called the Hendricks Club, had gathered on the night before Election Day to celebrate their victory, because it was Boston and it was ward politics and they were going to win the next day. So that evening at Lochovers, they said, let's celebrate the victory of our leader, a guy named Martin Lemazny. Martin Lemazny, who headed up the club, who was running for office, he would win tomorrow. Let's have a drink. So the bartender takes some whiskey, cuts up a lemon, some sugar, and then adds something special, some grenadine to it, which gives it a nice rosy color. It's passed around. Everyone loves this drink. It's great. And they said, well, what should we call it? What should we call this drink? And they said, let's call it the Ward 8, after Lemazny, who was the boss of the Ward 8. And I thought, oh, this is a great story. Part of my book, a good paragraph, wonderful little anecdote. And then I did something that no good historian should do. I started doing research. And I started investigating the story. And there were numerous holes in the story that just didn't add up. For one thing, Martin Lemazny, found out about him, he didn't drink. He was a teetotaler. He never drank. He never went to bars. In fact, he forbid people from drinking at the Hendricks Club, number one. Number two, grenadine. Grenadine was not popular till the 1910s. So what is it doing in this drink? So all of a sudden, instead of having a great story, I had a mystery to solve, and that would obsess me. Let me put this a little bit in context for you. I started this project thinking, well, you know, cocktails, a lot of them were invented around Prohibition because you had to mix something with all that bathtub gin to make it palatable, but that's not the case. Many of the famous cocktails that we know today were actually invented in what was called the golden age of the saloon, which was from roughly about the 1840s until the 1860s. So things like the mint julep, the Tom and Jerry's, the whiskey smash were outlined in a recipe book as early as 1862. And in fact, in 1842, Charles Dickens visited Boston and was amazed by the cocktails he found. He drank a gin sling, a sangaree, a mint julep, a sherry cobbler, and a timberdoodle, and other rare drinks. In fact, the timberdoodle is so rare that we have no idea what he was drinking. So it's conceivable that this Ward 8 was concocted for this special occasion. But why was it connected with Martin Lemazny? So I looked into Martin Lemazny, and Lemazny was an amazing politician. You don't hear much about him because he was a behind-the-scenes kind of guy. He knew the Fitzgeralds, he knew the early Kennedys, he was friends and then enemies, and then friends and enemies with Mayor Curley. But he was a good person to know in Boston. In fact, his nickname was the Boston Mahatma, the great soul. And he was known for this saying, although we're not quite sure he said it, but this is what he's known for saying. Never write if you can speak. Never speak if you can nod. Never nod if you can wink. So he was a behind-the-scenes character. So he is somebody who very clearly would be the object of adoration in 1898 for this creation of a drink. So when I started looking into it a little more, it turns out that grenadine was actually around the 1890s. And could have been used. And the reason that they were on lockovers was because the Hendricks Club had a favorite bartender who was over at lockovers that evening. By the way, I went to lockovers to try a war date, purely for research purposes. Took a picture of it, and of course, lockovers is no more. So my advice to you guys, keep those cell phones handy. Keep taking those pictures. But I did find out that the Ward 8 became an incredible popular drink throughout Boston. It's a little bit sweet because of the grenadine, but I found references to it for the 1930s, 1940s, 1950s, and in fact, it was very popular with women who were going to bars. And in fact, it was called the drink that would make a girl forget her mother's advice. So the thing about the Ward 8 is that it became kind of unknown during the 50s and 60s, but it's being revived. And now, if you go into a bar in Boston today, with a good mixologist, they'll know how to mix a Ward 8. In fact, there is a new restaurant called the Ward 8 in Boston, and you can get a very fine Ward 8 there. I had a few just for research purposes, of course. But if you drink it, just think, it's a drink that has a lot of history, a lot of politics, and a lot of mythology to it. And when you take a sip, try to nod, and if you can't nod, just wink. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, Stephanie Schorow. Hang on to that.
Sure.
So, Stephanie, I'm really interested in the idea that, you sort of had this moment where you sniffed out, there might be some mythology here. And I think that, anybody here who's into history, certainly those who are here who have written about history, you talk about, all right, well, now I'm going to get my critical mind going here. Even if it's on a topic, it's a cocktail, right? So, not, groundbreaking, not the end of the world, but you want to do your due diligence.
Definitely.
So, how do you start doing that? When you say, I looked into this, where do you go? Where does one go? Especially in a day and age where you kind of go on a computer, there's so much available there. You need to go beyond that. Where do you go?
Well, and actually you have to dismiss a lot of what you find on the internet.
That's what
the
librarians
first thing,
tell me that all the time.
So
yeah.
One thing you have to do is look for original sources.
And how do you do that? Where do you go looking?
Well, you basically try to go back through the sources that you have. You look at where they got their information from. For example, there's something called the Old Mr. Boston Drink Guide. And some of you who are into cocktails would have... Yeah, I see you out there.
I got one.
But you start looking back through the editions, and then you find, I have an edition I found from 1934 that actually has an illustration of a Ward 8 cocktail glass. So you have to go back into the original sources, into recipes from the 1920s, and even before that. Use the internet wisely. Use Google Scholar. Use Google Books. Don't use just Google.
Everybody get that?
Yeah. So you start developing into that, and then you have to drink a lot of cocktails, and
Great.
then
Also,
it all becomes very clear.
Really. Stephanie, so in my work here at GBH, one of the things that I do with the Curiosity Desk is I do these history pieces, which air most Fridays, and you and I have talked twice for stories that I've done.
Right. I give you only accurate information.
I
of course.
appreciate that. That's why I
Except
keep
the
coming
stuff
back.
I make
That is
up, but-
why I keep coming back. And because you give me cocktails after
That's
the
right,
interview.
right.
That's not true. Yes, it is. But I'm interested in understanding for you. You've written about such varied subjects.
Mm-hmm.
You've written about the cocktail. You've done fire and fire department history. You've done the Brinks heist in the North End. You're doing the combat zone now. How do you sort of end up deciding which project you land on? Like, what's the thing that gets you going where you're like, this is my next thing?
Well, you really have to follow your own sense of curiosity, which
I respect that.
But
Absolutely.
you have to look at something and say, okay, what excites me about it? What is interesting to me? And the rule I use is I try to write from a people's perspective. What are people going to be talking about? What affected their life? Not just what the politicians did, not just what the official stories are, but what's underneath the surface. And that you have to do a lot of interviewing. And you have to really call up people, get them to talk to you, and then verify what they have to say to you. Because people have great stories, but you have to check them out and make sure they're accurate, put the pieces together. It's almost like a detective novel sometimes when you're doing this research, because someone will tell you one little piece and it doesn't quite fit, but if you find this other little piece from someone else and you put it together, even on the Ward 8, and for a while I thought that this whole story was a mythology. I thought the whole thing was made up. And then I started finding information that verified certain dates and certain ingredients. Things were called different, like Lockovers wasn't called Lockovers at that point. It was called something else, but I found some references to that place, so I knew it existed. So,
Stephanie Schorow.
thank you.
So we got everybody up here on the stage, and actually, we don't always do this, but like, does anybody here out in the audience have a question, top of mind, top of head here that you want to throw out to one or multiple of our speakers? Something that you heard them talking about that leaves you wondering about something deeper or something more? Anybody? So a little bit more about the
No.
Boston Massacre.
Yeah, so thanks for the question. So the Boston Massacre, the term itself was used for propaganda. The image you probably think of when you think of the massacre is the one that Paul Revere did, that he plagiarized actually.
Totally.
Of the soldiers firing on this unarmed, innocent, small crowd. And it was actually much different than that. It was a rowdy crowd, about 150, 200 men, many of them who'd been drinking, were getting into a fight with 9 soldiers. And
So another mob.
exactly, it was another mob. And 3 people died immediately, and then 2 would die later from their wounds. And so it became to Bostonians in 1770, it was called the Bloody Massacre. And today we know it as the Boston Massacre, but that's purely propaganda to get other people, especially other colonies, to hate the British soldiers even more and to view Boston as a martyr in the common cause against the British. So really good question. And only 5 people. I mean, that's for real.
And also, it should be noted, as I understand it, first of all, our second president, John Adams, defends the soldiers in court, and they are all acquitted? Is that what happens? Or most of them are acquitted of the crime?
Yeah, so only 2 of them are charged, and they're charged with manslaughter. Everyone was up for murder, and they charged the captain separately from the 8 soldiers. They didn't want the captain, if the captain went down and was considered guilty, they felt that everyone would be guilty. So the captain was not guilty because he didn't order anyone to fire. Then, I mean, I don't want to take the time because it gets really crazy and interesting, but two people were convicted of manslaughter because they believed that they had prior motives to shooting on this crowd.
There you go. Boston Massacre stuff. Cool. Cool. Anybody else? Question. Burning question right here in the back. Yeah, come on up. Get the mic. Yes.
Oh, yeah.
I'm so nervous. I had a question that combines both politics of Boston and music, and that concerned when the actions that Mayor White took after Martin Luther King was assassinated involved Channel 2, and it involved some good backroom issues. I'd like to hear any perspective from the panelists can share in that.
All right, so this is a reference to you
James
start us
Brown,
off, James Brown.
playing the Boston Garden at that time.
Actually, a guy in the bathroom asked me about this as well. That's not a joke.
Yeah. What happened, James Brown played the Garden, I believe, the night after Martin Luther King was assassinated. And what Mayor White did was he urged people in Boston not to go and arranged with Channel 2 that there would be a...
Channel 2, by the way, is where you're standing.
Us.
This is
we
where
are the
we
world,
are
yeah.
here.
But he arranged that there would be a simulcast, and it was broadcast on TV. People, of course, went anyway, but because thanks to that, probably thanks to Mayor White, we've got a real good document of the show, which is now available on DVD. It's been bootlegged for a while, but it's now available, and it should be seen because it's a very intense performance. I mean, there's a couple of times when James Brown stops the crowd because they wanted things to get a little more agitated, and James Brown would kind of cool everybody down, saying, "Hold on, we're all together up here. Listen to me." And he took control, but it was a very a real notable show.
Anybody else? So she's asking Brett for his favorite local band from the 80s, 90s, and 2000s.
I'm kind of touring. I'll tell you my three favorite local bands of all time, which are Mishinga Burma, The Liars, and Throwing Muses, which have all been together for all of those decades. So I guess they can split them up together.
Can I ask you? Do you consider the Pixies a local band?
Oh yeah, of course. They be, if I was doing a top 10, they'd certainly be up there. Yeah. Top three clubs. I'm not going to put the Rat up top. You know why? Because I used to live on Kelton Street in Brighton, and which was mere stumbling distance from Bung Ratties when it was a great club, and all the bands, the Neighborhoods, the Outlet, all those bands that would play the Rat played Bung Ratties, and it was shorter to go, and I didn't have to worry about getting home at the end of the night. So Bung Ratties was a favorite. The Rat was certainly up there, and Night Stage, because that was like the great eclectic club. Does anyone remember Night Stage? Yeah. It was on Main Street in Cambridge, right around where Toscanini's is. A long litany of incredible shows that happened there. Not All Rock, King Sunny Ade played there. The King of Zydeco, Clifton Chenier played there. Junior Wells, Great Blues played there. That was where Elvis Costello watched Amy Mann, with Amy Mann watched Roger McGuinn one night. It was just one of those great little showcase clubs where all sorts of things would happen.
So I have a few questions before we wrap up, and I kind of want to hear all of your take on this. You know, history's one of those things where, it's a little bit of a niche, right? Like, I think most people have a certain amount of general interest in history, but the way that I think most of you guys are digging into it is a little bit more specialized. I wonder, do you guys, is it sort of lonely? Do you worry nobody's going to care about this thing that I'm doing, that I'm obsessing about, that I'm spending my time on? How do you sort of handle that? Like, you guys kind of pass the mic around and just kind of each take a crack at this.
Okay. I think that is a problem. It is kind of lonely because you are alone with your thoughts. You're alone in a library. You're in an archive. You're interviewing someone. And you might think something is really exciting, and you're telling a friend, and they're like, But then it was so cool. And like, yeah, whatever. So you do have to kind of have the courage to go forward. And the thing, I think the challenge is that if someone doesn't think it's interesting, somehow and you think it is, you've got to make it interesting in the way you write it up and the way you present the information.
I think, let's all admit it, we're all very interested in ourselves. And I think that history is really tied to our identity. So when you write about it or convey that information, I try to include that aspect of history. Because when you think of, why do I do it this way? Why do I eat this? Where did it come from? The answers are in history, unless anyone's got a time machine out there, which I want dibs on.
I used to be disgusting. Now I try to be amused. No, but I think a lot of the stuff we're talking about, rock and roll, cocktails, candy, violence, it all has a built-in audience. And I think the four of us represent things that never go out of style.
How can I top that? I would just say I grew up in San Diego, and California is a wonderful place, but my interest in the American Revolution, you can't really talk about Paul Revere in San Diego and have people be interested at all. So Boston is a unique place in that there is a
You find that there's, oh, wow. This, see, I'm on the other mic now, and I'm louder than everybody else, so they turned the gray one down. I see what happened, yeah. So you find that, you know, I'm also not from Massachusetts originally, but I am from Pennsylvania, near spent a lot of time in Philadelphia, which has a similar, really long history, at least here in America, right? Like in terms of like America, that's one of the large cities early on. But you see a difference between how people are here, just a general person.
That's true, and I think there's a certain, even if you grew up in Massachusetts and you probably walked the Freedom Trail as a kiddo, and even if you didn't understand it or appreciate it, you do appreciate that something really big happened here 250 years ago. So I do find that there is a difference because the history is so different here, and it still informs who we are today.
Very cool, very cool. This sort of brings me also to this question, and I think this myself a lot because I do these history pieces on the radio really often, and sometimes I find myself going like, well, like why am I doing this? Like what? It's of interest to me for sure, and I think that I have a sense that there's real value in the idea of looking back and either understanding where a particular thing came from, or understanding, wow, this thing that happened 200 years ago is exactly like what we're going through now, right? Like, so for you who really are, I mean, you guys are really real historians here. Like, what would you say is the value in people understanding sometimes really antiquated sort of side stories, or understanding and hearing the stories of things that happened 100 or 200 or 300 years ago? Why do this? Why dedicate your lives to it?
Well, sometimes we need to know where we were before we know where we are. In other words, we need to understand how we got to the spot. And if we don't know what happened, if we don't know why we use certain words, why the city is organized in a certain way, we don't really understand things today. Boston has had amazing history, not just colonial history, but recent history, racial issues, immigrant issues, and I think we need to understand that. We also need to preserve some of the objects that tell the story, because they reveal things about the way we used to live that we may not live that way now, but we need to understand how things used to be, to understand where we're going in the future.
I think part of it is that saying, the more things change, the more things stay the same. I think there's a certain level of comfort we get from, looking back at history and feeling something familiar or seeing something familiar. But I also think it's about connection. I talked about identity. Now I'm talking about connection with other people, and that can also go back in time to our own ancestors and also to people who we have absolutely, or we think we have no connection to, and you can see that there is a connection.
I think when you're talking about rock and roll or even folk music or jazz, you're only going back a century at the most. And in a lot of cases, certainly with rock music in Boston, as I mentioned, the G-Clefs are still alive, Barry and the Remains are still performing, and a lot of this music, even if they weren't, a lot of the music is still there to be discovered. And even though the backstories might be great, there might be a lot of great history to discover, but the music itself, in a lot of cases, is still pretty wonderful, and it's still there to be heard and be discovered.
Yeah, just kind of echoing Amanda's thoughts, that I think history is so exciting because in a way it's oddly comforting. As I mentioned, like, these violent mobs can be oddly comforting because it reminds us that people are people and they've been people for centuries, and they're frail human beings sometimes who feel jealous or angry or proud or happy and elated. And I think that's really exciting to see that take shape in a different time and a different place, and how then it affected that time and place.
Excellent. So before we go, I'm gonna since I have four well-read, very intelligent people here, and obviously very well-read, intelligent crowd, give yourselves a round of applause for being so great.
Woo woo!
I want you to leave us, if you guys can, with a recommendation. I'm sure you guys have all read many a history, and I'm not just talking about Boston, but just in general. And it doesn't have to be a book, a documentary, a story from history. As people who kind of live this for an audience who is into this, what would be something that you would recommend if I want to, like, just a great story from history? Where should I go looking? And don't be afraid to take me off the beaten path.
I think that the Ken Burns documentary on Prohibition was outstanding, and it really was very relevant to a lot of things today. Dark Tide, the molasses flood in Boston, if you haven't heard that story, by Steve Puleo. And I just finished The Devil in the White City, which was about the Chicago World's Fair. Excellent book. Yes, exactly.
One of my favorite books about history that I've recommended to a lot of people is actually about alcohol. It's called Drink. It's by Ian Gately, and it's really accessible, entertaining, and it is basically the history of civilization through alcohol. It's fascinating.
I recently read one of the best music books I've ever read, which is Mark Lewison's book, Tune In, which is the first in a projected 3-volume history of the Beatles. And in this book, it's 900 pages, and it ends when they record Love Me Do. So all the history you never even thought you'd care about, on, and yet it's fascinating, because it kind of tells you how the Beatles got there. And I have a new book called Don't All Thank Me at Once, The Lost Pop Genius of Scott Miller. It's not too bad.
The book I would recommend came out last year. It's called An Empire on the Edge by Nick Bunker. What's so special about this book is it dives really deep into British archives that most historians on this side of the pond don't have access to or don't take such a deep dive into. So it's really showing the British Empire as it's sort of crumbling in Boston, beginning in 1763 with the end of the French and Indian War.
All right, thanks, you guys. Let's give them one more big round of applause for sharing their big brains with us here tonight.
People are starting to think about, where does my food come from, and how is it being sourced, and what am I putting in my body? And I would say that the challenge of some of these new ways that we get dinner is that it creates an opacity around where our food comes from.